Hello everybody, this is Dr. Christopher White, and in today's presentation we're going to be looking at Cenozoic life history. So like the previous life history presentations, we're going to spend some time looking at life in the oceans, then we're going to move on to the plants, and then we're going to finish by looking at life on the continents. Okay, let's get going. So, through the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, evolution produced a range of quite interesting animals. However, by the time we make it into the Cenozoic, the flora and fauna present would be far more recognisable to us. Now, let's not forget though that the Cenozoic is 66 million years long, and it's getting longer every day, so there's still plenty of time for evolution to take place. It's just that the evolutionary processes which are going on will be bringing the plants and animals that we see closer and closer to those with which we are familiar. Now, during the Cenozoic, we're going to see the mammals, the birds, and the angiosperms, that's the flowering plants, recover from the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction. They're going to quickly diversify, and they're going to fill vacant niches left on the continents, in the oceans, and in the air. Now, when we think about the Cenozoic fossil record, we need to consider something called the pull of the recent. Now, the pull of the recent means that the fossil record for the Cenozoic is particularly extensive, and the evolutionary history for many species is near complete. Annoyingly, unfortunately, this isn't the case for humans. And the pull of the recent is the result of the fact that there's been less time between the animal dying and being fossilized and the present day. So this means that because there's a shorter time period, it means there's less chance for the fossil to be destroyed and lost from the fossil record. And so this means we have more fossils of Cenozoic animals, and so obviously that means our fossil record and therefore our understanding of Cenozoic evolution is going to be noticeably better when compared to the fossil record for the Mesozoic or the Paleozoic. Okay, so let's start in the oceans. So we're going to begin by thinking about marine invertebrates and phytoplankton. Now, the Cretaceous Tertiary impact and the associated mass extinction caused the loss of numerous marine species, with arguably the ammonites and the rudis probably the best known of the marine invertebrates that did not make it into the Cenozoic. Now, we should also remember that single-celled organisms like foraminifera, coccolithophores, diatoms and dinoflagellates all took a real beating during the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction. However, a few species from each of these groups did manage to make it through into the Cenozoic. Now, these species that managed to make it into the Cenozoic quickly recovered, they diversified, and they became the primary producers for the resurgent marine fauna. So their success essentially provides the primary food source to allow the marine environment to begin to recover. Now, in terms of the marine invertebrates, once they had recovered, groups like the foraminifera, the radiolarians, the corals, the bryozoans, the mollusks and the echinoids all become particularly prolific during the Cenozoic. Furthermore, the continental distribution and the associated changes in the global climate and ocean currents produced as the continents moved towards their current positions led to latitudinal temperature gradients being established which weren't present in the Mesozoic. Now, this means that each body of water that forms, so the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, North Pacific, South Pacific, Indian Ocean, etc., is going to have its own individual set of conditions, and so this is going to mean that life is going to adapt to those individual environments. So you're going to end up with a greater degree of diversity when it comes to marine fauna, and this is going to lead to organisms in general becoming more provincial, so they'll be more limited in their distribution. In the early Cenozoic, we see the coccolithophores, the diatoms and the dinoflagellates all recover rapidly, and this is going to be quite important because these single-celled photosynthesizing organisms that live in the water column are going to be very, very important because they are the basis of the marine food chain. Now, the diatoms in particular become especially numerous and diverse during the Miocene. So the increase in diatom diversity in numbers is likely a reflection of the lack of competition caused by the loss of other phytoplankton, so there's simply less competition, more food, and so they begin to flourish. But there's also changes in ocean temperature which are advantageous for the diatoms. So as we've discussed, the temperature of the oceans closer to the poles begins to decrease during the Cenozoic, and it just so happens that diatoms in particular quite like cold water. And so as we see these temperature changes occur, we begin to see diatoms becoming more and more established and more numerous in these colder water environments. Now, the rise of the Miocene diatoms is also possibly connected to increased volcanism. So one area in particular where we see diatoms doing extremely well is in the North Pacific. And this is an area that's going to be affected by numerous volcanic eruptions, particularly from the Aleutian Islands. And so these explosive eruptions are going to put out large quantities of ash and dust, which is going to be thrown into the surrounding ocean. Some of this ash and dust will begin to dissolve into the seawater, so this will put silica, SiO2, into the seawater, and this dissolved silica can then be used by the diatoms to grow their shells. And so the presence of this additional silica is going to be also quite advantageous for the diatoms. Another important marine microorganism are the foraminifera. Now, foraminifera are zooplankton. This means they do not photosynthesize. Instead, they consume other smaller microorganisms or food particles that they find on the seafloor or in the water column. Now, during the Cenozoic, we see foraminifera doing particularly well in warm water environments, with the Tethys/Indian Ocean Basin a particularly hot spot for them. Now, they become so abundant in some cases that their shells/skeletons will end up forming limestones. Now, just to give you some idea, foraminifera are microorganisms. They're tiny. So just try and imagine how many shells it would take to form a thick enough layer of sediment to produce a decent sized layer of limestone. You would need literally billions or trillions of foraminifera shells in order to do this. So this shows you just how successful they are in these warm water environments during the Cenozoic. Now, in terms of reef building organisms, we know that reefs in the Mesozoic were dominated by the rudists. Now, the rudists do not make it into the Cenozoic. They're killed off by the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction. Now, this means in the Cenozoic, the way is completely open for the corals to become the dominant reef building organism. So what we see during the Cenozoic is we see the corals becoming especially common in the warm waters of the Indo-Pacific and the Caribbean. And of course, this makes perfect sense. These are the types of environments in which we would expect to find corals doing extremely well. Now, along with the corals, we also see bryozoans and crinoids increasing during the early to middle Cenozoic. So they are also important reef building organisms during the first half of the Cenozoic. Now, just to give you some idea, by the way, we have a picture of a modern bryozoan up here. So they're filter feeding organisms. So what happens is the water passes through these sieve-like structures and small food particles are removed and consumed. And here's an example of a fossilized Cenozoic bryozoan just for comparison there. In terms of crinoids, they're also filter-feeding organisms. They have these feather-like appendages on their limbs. They will catch small food particles which get passed down the limb to the base of the crinoid down here, where there's essentially a mouth, and behind the mouth obviously a stomach, where the food particles will be consumed. And once again, here's a crinoid fossil just to show you what they look like in the fossil record. Now, as I was saying, the bryozoans and the crinoids do pretty well in the early to middle Cenozoic, although we do see them becoming less common as global ocean temperatures begin to decrease in the later portions of the Cenozoic. So, although they are still important reef building organisms, they aren't as important as they were in the first half of the Cenozoic. So in terms of the shelly marine invertebrates, we see that during the Cenozoic, the bivalves and the gastropods become dominant. Now, the brachiopods are also present, but they are a relatively minor component of the marine invertebrate faunas, and that's because they've never really recovered from the Permo-Trias mass extinction at the end of the Paleozoic. From that point on, they were just being outcompeted by the bivalves all the way through the Mesozoic, and that's continued into the Cenozoic. We see nautiloids, squid and octopi fill the void for nectonic invertebrates left by the loss of the ammonites and the belemnites. So if you remember, the ammonites in particular were very, very numerous in the water column during the Mesozoic, but of course as we move into the Cenozoic they are gone, and so we see the nautiloids, the squid and the octopi taking that niche. In terms of the echinoids, we see them recover and they become an important epifaunal organism. So we see lots and lots of, for instance, sea urchins moving across the seafloor, so that's the epifaunal environment. We do, however, also see some of the echinoids making their way into the infaunal environment, so actually going down into the sediment. And once again, in this environment, they become particularly successful. And we can actually see this change quite nicely in the fossil record. So if we look at this sea urchin here, you'll notice it's covered in spines, obviously for defensive purposes. Now, if you're on the seafloor and you're exposed, having spines is a great idea. However, the second you try and move through any sediment, having spines actually becomes an impediment. They get in the way. So what we can see in the Cenozoic is we see the appearance of a number of relatively smooth-shelled echinoids. And so this is showing us they're moving from the exposed epifaunal environment into the more protected infaunal environment. So some of you are probably wondering, okay, well, what was happening during the Cenozoic with regard to the marine vertebrates? Well, we know that the most advanced form of fish, the teleosts, were established in the Mesozoic, and they make it across into the Cenozoic, and they simply increase in number and diversify throughout the Cenozoic. The same goes for the cartilaginous fish, that includes the sharks. So when it really comes down to it, there aren't significant changes when it comes to the marine vertebrates. Now, the one major change that does occur is that from the mid to late Cenozoic we are going to see the introduction of large amounts of marine mammals in the form of whales and dolphins, for instance, and we're going to be discussing those in greater detail later in this presentation. So now let's move on to Cenozoic vegetation and climate. Now, as we've discussed in the past, the Cenozoic has seen a general cooling trend, and we can see it on this diagram over here. We've seen this diagram before, so I'm not going to discuss it, but what you can see is over time there's been a gradual decrease in temperature during the Cenozoic. We can see that decrease in temperature hasn't been a smooth gradual change. It's been, it's had quite a lot of topography, but on the whole we can see the downward trend is quite clear. Now, oxygen 18, oxygen 16 data from deep marine sediments indicates that there was a global warming period around the Paleocene-Eocene boundary, so this region right here. And this is referred to as the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum, and this is when we're going to have the highest temperatures occurring during the Cenozoic. Now, it seems that around this time the circulation of warmer tropical waters into the higher latitudes stalls, and this results in deep oceanic water at or near the tropics becoming warmer. So typically what happens is water gets warmed up in the tropics and then it moves towards the north or the south pole, and as this warm water leaves the tropics it gets replaced by cold water being pulled in along the seafloor from the higher latitudes towards the equator. So essentially we have a conveyor belt system. Warm water moves towards the poles and colder water from the poles gets pulled back down towards the equator. So we have water constantly being replenished. Now, what we see happening in the Cenozoic is for a period of time, especially around this Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, we think this circulation begins to stall a bit. And so what this means is you're not having cold water coming back into these equatorial regions, and so we begin to see the water temperature in these equatorial regions becoming warmer and warmer, both on the surface and in the deep marine environment, so near the seafloor, and this is going to become very, very important. So we can see that the deep water environments in these equatorial regions are becoming warmer because we can see a change in the deep sea foraminifera. So we see lots of foraminifera that prefer deep water, colder environments becoming extinct in these tropical areas, and so this is obviously telling us that these deep water temperatures are on the increase. Now, the reason this increase in these deep water temperatures is important is because if we look at this diagram over here, you will notice that the equatorial region, okay, that's essentially 30 degrees north and south of the equator, is absolutely loaded with gas hydrate deposits. So what's a gas hydrate? Well, here's a picture of one right here. So a gas hydrate is a mixture of methane and water, which is put under lots and lots of pressure at quite low temperatures, and it causes the methane in the water to form a solid phase, which we call gas hydrate. Now the problem is that gas hydrates don't like warm temperatures. So the second the deep ocean water in these equatorial regions began to warm up, well, that's going to cause the gas hydrates to become unstable. And so this is going to mean they're going to break down, and the methane in them is going to be released, and that methane will obviously bubble up from the seafloor and enter the atmosphere. And as we know, methane is a very strong greenhouse gas. It's about 20 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so a large release of methane produced by gas hydrate destruction will cause a very substantial change in the greenhouse effect, leading to a period of global warming. And this is what we're probably seeing at this Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Now, in terms of North America, we can see that we have tropical conditions during the Paleocene and the Eocene during this period of high temperatures. Now, at the end of the Eocene, we begin to see a rapid decrease in temperature, with average temperatures decreasing by up to 7 Celsius in a period of about 3 million years. So as we're as the Eocene's coming to the end and we're heading into the Oligocene, something is clearly changing that's causing the greenhouse effect to become weaker. So there are a couple of possible explanations which might explain the weakening of the greenhouse effect that we see at the end of the Eocene. The first possibility is that we re-establish ocean circulation. Now, this is going to allow colder water from higher latitude environments to begin to move back towards the equator. So this means that these deep marine tropical environments that were experiencing elevated temperatures are all of a sudden going to have an influx of cold water, and this is going to help to drive down the water temperature and stabilize any gas hydrates that are still present. Obviously, once the gas hydrates are stabilized, they're going to stop breaking down and releasing methane. The other possibility is that maybe by the end of the Eocene, the tropical gas hydrate deposits have simply been exhausted. So there's no more gas hydrate actually left to break down. And if there's no more gas hydrate, that means no more methane being released. This means any methane that's present in the atmosphere towards the end of the Eocene will steadily be stripped out, and so over time we're going to see a steady weakening of the greenhouse effect and therefore a decrease in global temperatures. Now, as we transition from the Eocene into the Oligocene, we do see that global temperatures drop, and we see the Oligocene on the whole has relatively stable conditions, and this affects both the North America and globally. So on the whole, during the Oligocene, everything is pretty stable. Now, as we head from the Oligocene into the Miocene, there is a bit of a temperature spike. However, by the middle Miocene, this spike has essentially evened out, and so when we look at the Oligocene and Miocene as a whole, we see that in general, if we average it out, the temperature is relatively stable. Now, from the middle Miocene onwards, so that's heading into the Pliocene and the Pleistocene, we see that there is a noticeable and quite sharp decrease in global temperatures. Now, over the past 25 million years, so that's from the middle Miocene until the present day, we've noticed that the mid-continent region of North America has undergone a steady decrease in precipitation, and this is associated with this general decrease in global temperatures. So this change in the global environment caused the large Oligocene forests, which did cover the center of North America, to begin to die back, and they are replaced by savanna conditions. So savanna conditions essentially means you have lots and lots of grassland with scattered trees, and so this is reflecting both a decrease in temperature and also a decrease in precipitation. So conditions are getting harder and the forests of the Oligocene begin to die back. Now, as this temperature decrease begins to accelerate, we begin to see even the savanna conditions begin to become untenable, and the savanna organisms begin to get replaced by a steppe environment. And so in a steppe environment, we start to see the introduction of short, drought-resistant grasses. And so this is the type of environment you tend to get forming along desert margins. And so this change in the fauna and flora of the interior of North America is reflecting this general cooling trend we see from the middle Miocene onwards. So during the Cenozoic, we see the angiosperms, that's the flowering plants, continue their diversification. Now, if you remember, the angiosperms make their appearance in the Cretaceous, and they very quickly begin to outcompete the other types of plant. Now, they make it through the Cretaceous tertiary mass extinction, and they very quickly re-establish themselves and continue their dominance over the seedless vascular plants and the gymnosperms. Now, the seedless vascular plants and the gymnosperms are still important groups of plants, however their distribution is far more limited. So we've already discussed how seedless vascular plants are on the whole limited to environments which tend to be quite wet, whereas the gymnosperms are typically limited to environments which are now quite cold and dry. So think of environments like the coniferous forests of northern Canada and northern Russia. So as we transition into the Cenozoic, we see the loss of the uniform temperature distribution which we experienced during the Mesozoic. So if you remember, during the Triassic, Jurassic and Cretaceous, we had a more homogeneous atmosphere, and this meant that warm weather conditions extended quite a long way north and south from the equator. So just to give you some idea, we were experiencing conditions which could be described as temperate to tropical, all the way as high as 60 degrees north of the equator. That's the southern tip of Greenland. Now, this means that because you had this nice homogenized environment, it meant that plant life that was comfortable existing in the tropics could extend quite a long way north or south of the equator. And this resulted in quite a homogeneous makeup when it came to flora during the Triassic, Jurassic and Cretaceous, because they could be so widely distributed because the conditions were so similar. Now, as we move into the Cenozoic, we see the establishment of distinct climatic zones, and obviously each of these zones is going to have its own set of conditions, and so this is going to mean plants are going to have to evolve to meet those conditions. So we're going to see an increase in the diversification of plant life, and we're going to see plants become more limited in their distribution because they become so specialized to those specific conditions. Now, a good example of these specializations is the leaf design shown by plants from warm, humid climates. So think of something like a rainforest. Now, these leaves tend to have quite a large size, they tend to have smooth margins, and they tend to have what's referred to as a drip tip. Now, the size of the leaf is a reflection of the fact they are living in an environment which is very, very wet. So typically, the larger the leaf, the more water you will lose through the process of transpiration. So think of that essentially as the plant sweating. So larger the leaf, the more water you will lose. However, because these plants are living in an environment that has a very, very high rate of rainfall, it means they can very quickly replace any water which is lost. And so this means they have the capacity to have quite large leaves, and this is advantageous because the larger the leaf, the more sunlight it can collect, and so the more efficient you will be at photosynthesis. Now, in terms of the other portions of the leaf design, the smooth margins and the drip tip, this is a design feature that's required to get water off the leaf as fast as possible. So having water sitting on your leaf is actually going to inhibit your ability to successfully photosynthesize. So what you want as a plant is you want to get that water off your leaf as fast as possible. And so having the smooth margins and the drip tip helps these leaves to get rid of the water off the surface, thereby allowing them to photosynthesize at the high, with greatest efficiency. When we look at plants from cooler, drier zones, we see they tend to have smaller leaves and no drip tip. Now, when I'm talking about a cooler or drier zone, I'm talking about a more temperate environment, similar to the type of environment experienced by much of North America and Europe. Now, the smaller size reduces water loss, so as we've already discussed, the larger the leaf, the more water you will lose through transpiration. Now, if you're in a wet environment like a rainforest, that's not a problem because you can replenish the water. In contrast, when you are in a drier climatic band, well, then you have a bit of an issue. So typically the easiest thing to do is make your leaves smaller to limit that water loss. Now, the other change that the smaller leaf induces is a change in the thickness of the boundary layer. So the boundary layer is a layer of still air that surrounds the leaf. Typically, the bigger the leaf, the thicker the boundary layer will be. Now, the boundary layer is going to act as an insulator. So this means that if your leaf is on a plant in a hot, humid climate, it means that during the day the leaf is going to get heated up, and because the boundary layer is going to be quite thick, it means it's going to have difficulty losing that heat. And so the only way the leaf can get rid of that excess heat is through transpiration, so by losing water. Now, this isn't a problem in humid climates. However, if you're in a drier climate, you can't lose that water. So what you really want is a thin boundary layer so your leaf doesn't get too hot. And so having a smaller leaf allows you to have the thinner boundary layer. And this not only allows your leaf to not only overheat, it also allows your leaf to absorb heat from the surrounding environment more efficiently. So this is going to reduce the chances of your leaf getting too cold and becoming damaged. So the diagram over here on the right is showing us changes in the percentage of plant species with smooth margin leaves from 4 locations in North America. So we have the Mississippi embayment, Northern California, Pacific Northwest and Southern Alaska. Now, we know that smooth margin leaves are associated with warm, humid conditions. So what you'll see is that for all of these 4 locations, we can see that a substantial portion of the flora in those areas during the Paleocene and the Eocene was made up of plants with smooth margin leaves. So this is telling us conditions were on the whole quite warm and quite humid. And of course, this makes perfect sense because we know that during the Paleocene and the Eocene, we were experiencing the high temperatures associated with the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Now, as we move into the Oligocene, we can see that the percentage of smooth margin leaves in Northern California, the Pacific Northwest and Southern Alaska begins to drop off quite quickly. You can see it especially strongly there with the trend for Southern Alaska. And so this is showing us that what we have is a situation where we are losing essentially these warm conditions, and conditions are getting colder and or drier. So we know that in the case of Northern California, conditions actually stay relatively warm. However, things begin to get drier as we progress further into the Cenozoic. So that's going to reduce the efficiency of these smooth margined leaves. And so we're going to see plants that have smooth margin leaves beginning to become less common. In the case of the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, we have a decrease in temperature. And so obviously this is going to mean, once again, having these big leaves is actually going to be a bit of a problem. And so you're going to see these large leaved plants being replaced by plants that have smaller leaves more suited to the colder conditions. And so, we can see this in the fossil record. And so this is a strong indicator showing us, that we have this temperature change, and we can see it from these plant fossils. Now, when we look at fossil plants from the western interior of North America, they indicate that during the Paleocene, Eocene and early Oligocene, the area contained palms and fern trees, indicating warm, humid climates. Now, in Colorado, of the 100 or so Paleocene species of trees identified, 70 of those had smooth margin leaves, many with drip tips, and that suggests leaves designed for a rainforest-like set of conditions, so quite warm, quite humid. Now, as we transition into the Oligocene, we begin to see these forests dying back as conditions get cooler. And of course, as we've discussed, this is consistent with the gradual temperature decrease which we see throughout the whole Cenozoic. So let's move on to Cenozoic vertebrates, and we're going to begin with Cenozoic birds. Now, during the Paleogene, we begin to see the first members of several living orders of bird making their appearance. So we see orders like the owls, the ducks, the vultures, the hawks and the penguins beginning to appear. we see songbirds begin to diversify during the middle Cenozoic, particularly during the Miocene. And this means by about 5 to 10 million years ago, many of the present-day genuses of birds were already established. So this means if we were to jump in a time machine and go back 7 million years, when we got out and we started looking at the birds which we saw, they would on the whole look quite familiar to us. Now, we see birds continue to diversify into the Pleistocene. However, from that point onwards, their diversity has decreased slightly. That's obviously going to be a reflection of the tougher conditions experienced during the Ice Age. Now, during the present day, we can see that birds vary significantly with regard to diet, habitat, adaptations and size, and this isn't a huge surprise because of course we know we have all these different climatic bands established during the Cenozoic. This obviously means that individual species of birds will have to adapt to their local environment, and so that's obviously going to lead to quite a lot of diversity in terms of body design. So just to give you some idea about some of the changes which we see when it comes to birds during the Cenozoic, the picture that we can see here is of a Titanus bird, otherwise known as a terror bird, and they're going to become an interesting group that makes their appearance during the Cenozoic, and we're actually going to discuss them in the next slide. When we look at the skeletal structures displayed by Cenozoic birds, we see they differ relatively little from the skeletal structures displayed by early birds from the Mesozoic, so something like Archaeopteryx. Now, this is because the adaptations required for things like flight, so hollow bones for instance, really limit the possibility for variation, because once you've established a system that works, evolution isn't really going to change it that much. So when it comes down to it, the birds that fly show relatively little variation in the general design. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to this rule, and these are groups of birds that have developed to move into different environments. So the classic example would be the penguins. So the penguins have developed extremely robust wing bones and wing muscles, and they've also shortened their leg length, and this is a response of their movement into the marine environment. So obviously the big powerful wings are required for propulsion through the water, whilst the short legs help to create a more streamlined body. In the case of the flightless birds, so let's for instance think of something like an ostrich, we see that they develop a more robust skeleton and they develop smaller wings. Typically the smaller wings are because, well, if you're not flying, the wings will often actually get in the way. They're a bit of a hindrance, so having smaller wings can often be, advantageous. In terms of the more robust skeletons, well, these are animals which are existing on the continents. So, they don't have to worry themselves with having lighter bones designed for flight. So that means the bones can become bigger, more heavy set, stronger, and obviously this is going to be more advantageous for movement on the continents. Now, following the extinction of the dinosaurs, the major land-dwelling predators during the Paleocene and Eocene were actually flightless birds. We typically assume that once the dinosaurs are gone, the mammals make their move and then that's pretty much it. In reality though, it took a while for large mammalian predators to really become established, so the initial running was actually done by the flightless birds. Now, among these Cenozoic birds, arguably the best known group are the Titanus birds. They are often referred to as the terror birds, and we saw a picture of one on the previous slide here. So you can see these birds have very big, very strong beaks designed for attacking their prey. They have strong, sturdy legs designed for movement on the continents, with long claws once again for attacking their prey, and we can see they have small vestigial wings. So in terms of the Titanus bird design, they stood up to about 2.5 meters in height at tallest. They had large heads with big powerful beaks, as I say, for attacking their prey, large talons on their feet, once again for attacking their prey, and small vestigial wings. Now, when we look at the Titanus bird design, we actually see for the size of them, they had quite short legs. So if you think of something like an ostrich, we know that ostriches are quite quick. And if we look at the ostrich, for the size of the bird, we can see it has very, very long legs. In comparison, the Titanus bird actually has shorter legs compared to its body size. And this would suggest that on the whole, the Titanus birds probably weren't that quick, and they probably hunted larger, slower mammals as their prey. And this may well explain why their head design in particular becomes so amazingly overdeveloped, because instead of, going after smaller, faster prey, they're going after bigger, tougher prey. So, having really strong weaponry is going to be an advantage in terms of killing the animal you're going after. Now, we see the Titanous birds and their associated genuses were widespread in Europe, North America, and South America. And they remained important predators in South America up until about 2 million years ago. Now, other noticeable flightless birds include the elephant birds of Madagascar. So, just to give you some idea, they're about 500 kilograms in weight, which puts them at about the same mass as a male grizzly bear. So these were very big animals. And we also have the moas of New Zealand, and they were 3-meter tall birds similar to kiwis, although the beak shape was somewhat different. Now, both of these types of birds are known from Pleistocene deposits, and they interestingly went extinct after the first known arrival of humans. I wonder why that happened. And so just so you can see for comparison, here we have a couple of diagrams showing you the different sizes. So here we have a modern day ostrich in red, just to show you the basic difference. And here we have an elephant bird in this light purple. Down here we have moas birds, and you can see the largest example, number 4 here, reached a height in excess of about 3.5 meters. Each one of these squares represents 1 meter. And so, this is showing you the extreme size of these birds. Now, it's interesting when you think about it that birds are actually just as successful as mammals, although unfortunately, because human beings are mammals, we have a bit of a bias towards our own group, and so we tend to think that mammals are actually the most successful group of the Cenozoic. In reality, though, the birds are just as successful as the mammals, and so we shouldn't really overlook their contribution to the fauna of the Cenozoic. So this is a good place to stop part 1, so please stop the video, get up, have a walk around, go and get a glass of water, take 5 or 10 minutes to relax, and then please come back for part 2.